Lightweight, cheap, and fast. Pick two. That's how the saying goes anyway. Somehow though, with these lenses, you can actually have all three. There's something quite disruptive about them because on paper they don't really make sense. You've got genuinely fast T1.5 full frame cine primes in a tiny M-mount housing, priced already pretty competitively, and then Thypoch goes and slaps a steep Black Friday discount on top of that. It's the sort of combination that makes you assume there has to be a compromise hiding somewhere, whether that's in the build, the character, or some other strange usability quirk that only shows up once you actually go out and try and make something with them. The short version, which is mildly inconvenient for me as a reviewer, is that I haven't really found the catch yet. The two lenses I've been using are the Thypoch Simera-C 21mm and 35mm, both in M-mount, supplied with Thypoch's positive lock M to Z and M to E adapters. That's meant that I've been running them mainly on the Nikon ZR and Sony ZV-E1. They're full frame, they open up to T1.5, and they are genuinely ultra compact and lightweight in the way that can really matter for solo operators. And they behave like proper cinema lenses, rather than stills glass that's been dressed up or rehoused for the occasion. Thypoch's own description is fairly straightforward. T1.5, fast aperture, minimal chromatic aberration, high resolution, what they call clinical image quality, designed to meet film industry standards and fully compatible with everything from entry-level mirrorless cameras and gimbals through to things like the DJI Ronin 4D, all the way up to Arri cinema bodies. In the hand, that translates to a very small housing with very grown-up ergonomics. A long, smooth focus throw with hard stops, proper cine-style gearing on focus and iris, and a sensible front diameter too. Also a weight that feels reassuring without being silly on the small bodies that they're well suited to. They don't feel like fine jewellery, no. They feel very much like tools that want to live on a camera that's working for its keep. Where they get really interesting for me is where they sit on the clinical versus character spectrum, because if you've seen my review of the Nissi Athena primes, you'll know that I tend to prefer a very clean, almost invisible lens as a starting point. I like the optics to draw what's in front of them with high fidelity and as few quirks as possible, so that any personality in the image is a choice I've made. Filtration, atmosphere, production design, grading, rather than something that's baked irrevocably into the glass. The Simera-C lenses sit just one notch to the more characterful side of that preference. They're not as clinical as the Athena set, but they're nowhere near the extreme vintage end either. In practical terms, they are properly sharp. They resolve plenty of detail, chromatic aberration really is very well controlled, and contrast is nicely behaved too. You can absolutely shoot them in a way that feels modern and neutral, with plenty of information to work with in the grade. But there's a subtle vintage flavour in the way the focus falls off, the way background melts away, and especially in the way they flare. That's where you start to feel that these aren't just tiny test chart monsters. The flares in particular are very tastefully handled. You can let a practical or a window or even the sun sit just off axis, and you get something that feels intentional and cinematic rather than intrusive. You keep usable contrast, you keep that sense of clarity in the midtones, but you get a bit of shape and a bit of colour that reminds you that the lens is actually participating in the image capture without ever taking over. It's not the full halo and haze, look at me, I'm a vintage lens effect. It's a much more considered lift that you can lean into or away from depending on how you light. For someone like me who instinctively gravitates towards the very clinical end of the spectrum, this feels like a surprisingly comfortable near middle ground. Form factor is where the whole proposition really clicks, especially once you actually put them on cameras like the Nikon ZR and the Sony ZV-E1. Both of these bodies are small, and once you hang a big photo zoom or a chunky modern 1.4 prime off the front, they start to look and handle a bit silly. Tiny bodies, enormous lenses, nah. With the Simera-C lenses, the whole package suddenly makes sense again. The rig becomes a compact cine setup rather than an overloaded hybrid. The weight is low enough that solo operation feels natural, hand-holding, sticking it on a slider, putting it on a gimbal, presumably, because gimbals aren't really my thing. But the handling is very cine. Long focus throw, repeatable marks, smooth, declicked iris, and all the controls sitting exactly where you expect them to. Thypoch's ultra compact and lightweight, ideal for solo operations line isn't just marketing copy in this case. It's actually how these behave in the field. They feel purpose-built for that one-person crew who still wants the discipline and repeatability of cinema glass. One slightly unexpected benefit for me has been how much these lenses have improved my relationship with the Nikon ZR in particular. I've talked in other videos about being a bit underwhelmed by the ZR's stabilisation performance, and I'm increasingly convinced that a lot of that might have come down to the lenses I was using initially. Most of my early testing was done with Sony glass, adapted via the Megadap adapter, and I always had the sense that something was slightly off in the conversation between lens and body. The IBIS worked, but it felt a bit vague. You didn't really get that reassuring, precise, often a bit mechanical sense of the camera really understanding the lens that was attached. As well as that, every now and then the whole sensor would do this violent shift, and I'm still not sure what the source of that problem was. As soon as I switched to these manual M-mount lenses and told the ZR what I was doing, and to do that you go into the non-CPU lens settings, you set the focal length and maximum aperture property, the stabilization behavior improved noticeably. It still isn't magically transformed into a gyro-stabilized FX6, but it feels a lot more predictable and much more supportive, which means handheld work is substantially more enjoyable. If that little ZR stabilization discovery was at all useful, that's basically a big part of what this channel is. Real-world fixes and slightly nerdy configuration changes that make your kit easier to live and work with, hopefully. If you want more of that in your feed, hit subscribe now while you're thinking about it, so that YouTube actually shows you the next one instead of you trying to remember what this channel was called in a few weeks' time. It's Western Approaches, by the way. It's also one of those slightly hidden upsides of a proper manual lens that doesn't really show up in the specs. When you commit to manual focus and manual iris, especially on a camera like the Nikon ZR, which leans heavily on the word cinema in all of its branding, you're forced into a way of working that's a lot slower, a lot more deliberate, and frankly more in line with the whole notion of cinema cameras. You're choosing your focal length, you're riding focus yourself, you're often operating wide open at t1.5 in fairly low light, and the lens becomes a partner in the shot rather than just some automated convenience. Now, somewhere around this point is probably a good moment to explain how exactly these lenses ended up on this desk. Thypoch sent over the Simera-C 21mm and 35mm in M-mount, along with their positive lock M to Z and M to E adapters, and they've offered to let me keep one lens in exchange for doing this real-world testing and making this video. There's no script from them, and they don't get to see or approve this before it goes live, and the choice of which focal length I keep is entirely my own, but there is that commercial relationship here, and I think that as context always matters, especially when we start talking about value for money. On the value side, things are, frankly, pretty punchy at the moment. In normal times, the Simera-C primes sit in what you'd call the serious but not silly part of the market, not an impulsive purchase, but significantly more affordable than a lot of full-frame cine options that are often twice the size, twice the weight, and don't necessarily give you twice the performance. However, Thypoch is currently running a Black Friday promotion that stacks a pretty steep discount on top of that. Between the 11th of November and the 3rd of December, they're offering up to around 17% off Simera-C lenses, and even bigger overall savings if you go for a 4 or 5 lens kit, including bundles that pair the Simera-C set with the Kata zooms from their sister brand DZO. So if you already know you want to build out a small cine kit, the numbers for these start to look very compelling very quickly. On top of that, they give me a little sweetener for people who are watching this channel. If you're picking one of these up during that Black Friday window and you use the code JACKFILMED at checkout, it will take an additional 5% off whatever discount is already applied. I'm very aware that that's probably the most influencer sentence I've ever said on this channel, but the way I look at it is simple. If you've already decided that these lenses fit your work and your budget, you might as well keep a bit more of your money in your own pocket. The discount code is my Instagram handle, by the way. Back to how they actually look though, because that's what ultimately matters. In terms of image character, I'd say the Simera-C line leans towards that modern, clean, sweet spot that's becoming increasingly prevalent with new lenses. There's plenty of resolution, details hold up very nicely even when you start punching in, they handle high contrast edges without spraying purple and green fringing everywhere, and they don't seem particularly fragile under a strong backlight. If you want to keep things crisp and contemporary, you absolutely can. Straight through image, rich contrast, neutral colour that grades very happily. If, on the other hand, you want to step towards a gentler, more nostalgic feel, they respond very nicely to diffusion and to slightly softer grades, and that underlying hint of vintage in the fall-off and flare means you don't have to fight them to get that look. For me, that balance is the real selling point. I can still treat them like sensible, nearly clinical lenses in the same way I would do with the Nisi Athena primes, knowing that if I built a scene with flags and haze and a bit of filtration, I'll get a look with character that feels very chosen instead of imposed. But if I want to walk around in the available light at t1.5 on a small camera, shooting interiors or streets or handheld documentary moments, the lenses add just enough personality that the image never feels sterile. In use, the 21mm and 35mm cover a lot of ground. The 21mm is one of those focal lengths that's wide enough to feel expansive and a little bit dramatic, but not so wide that you're constantly battling distorted faces or trying to bend verticals back into shape in post. It's been lovely for interiors, which is a big part of what I do, for establishing shots, for handheld moving through space work, and for general travel style footage where you want to show environment and context while still being close to the action. The 35mm, by contrast, feels immediately more intimate. Step in a little closer, fill the frame with a person or a small part of the room, and you get that very natural perspective that just works for conversations. It works for portraits, and small observational moments too. On something like the ZR or the ZV-E1, it becomes an extremely versatile focal length, equally happy sat on a tripod, in a talking head setup, or wandering around handheld grabbing cutaways. The one significant hole in my testing so far is that I don't yet have a way to adapt M-mount to RF for my Red Komodo X, which is still my personal benchmark for image quality and dynamic range. That's very much on my to-do list because I'm really curious to see how this tiny lens holds up once it's sitting in front of a more traditional cinema camera on a bigger commercial project. For the moment though, I think it's probably most useful that my experience has mostly been with the Nikon ZR and Sony ZV-E1 because that's the reality for a lot of people. Small bodies, solo operation, minimal or no crew, trying to coax something that feels cinematic out of gear that also needs to fit into a backpack. If you like seeing how this kind of kit actually slots into real-world jobs, rather than just YouTube tests, have a look at my Instagram, which is JackFilmed. That's where I share more behind the scenes from commercial shoots, a few of the rigs that never really justify a full YouTube episode, and bits of life around the coast as well. So if you like camera nerdery, but you'd also quite like to see what the stuff looks like when it's actually earning its keep, that's the place. Stepping back from the details a moment, the value proposition as I see it is this. You're getting genuinely fast T1.5 full-frame cine primes that are small enough to live full time if needed on a compact mirrorless body. You're getting image quality that leans towards the clean and controlled end of the spectrum, while still offering a subtle dose of character in the fall-off and flare. You're getting build and ergonomics designed to meet film industry standards, rather than stills conventions. And, at least during this Black Friday window, you're getting all of that at a price that steeply undercuts a lot of the more established competition in the space. The only real problem I've run into is a very specific kind of nice-to-have problem, which is that Thypoch has slightly stitched me up by sending me 2 excellent focal lengths, and then telling me I'm only allowed to keep 1. The 21mm is gorgeously wide and incredibly usable. It's perfect for my work, interiors, travel, seafront walks, establishing shots, all the things that I shoot a lot. The 35mm, on the other hand, has that extra intimacy that feels spot on when you're working with people. You can step in a bit closer, compress the space just enough, and it's immediately flattering in a way that makes you just want to keep rolling. The agreement was that I get to keep one of them in exchange for doing this testing and making this video, but having now spent time with both, I have no idea which way I'm going to go. It's the kind of dilemma that tells you that the lenses themselves are doing something very right, because I can immediately imagine a place for both of them in my kit. There is an even bigger danger, of course, is that now I actually own an M-mount cine lens, I've opened the door to a completely new rabbit hole. So if anyone like happens to be watching and would like to lend me something to review, my email is probably somewhere in the description. I can't guarantee it won't end up going to sea during a lifeboat launch, but I can guarantee that I will love and care for it in my own way. If you've got any questions about these lenses, or if you're running the Simera-C line on your own cameras, especially anything a bit more exotic like a Ronin 4D or Arri body, I would love to know, so let me know in the comments. I'd be really interested to hear how they're behaving in those other ecosystems, and not just on slightly temperamental little cameras like the ZR. And if you're a fellow Nikon ZR owner, and you've been a bit on the fence about it, I'd be curious to hear about whether switching to a proper manual lens has changed how you feel about the camera in the same way that it has done for me. If this helped, please consider subscribing. It tells YouTube to show you the next one, whether that's another ZR episode, a lens deep dive, or something completely different from the kit shelves. And just to circle back to the value side one last time, if you were already planning to pick up a Simera-C during the Black Friday sale, the code JackFilmed at checkout will shave a little extra off the already steep discount. So if these lenses are already on your list or in your basket, you might as well hang on to a little bit more of your own budget. I'm Jack. Whatever this is, I'm calling Western Approaches. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.